Assistant Director of the Institute for International Business and Center for International Business Education and Research at CU Denver. I'm very excited to be here with you all today. And I'd like to introduce Manuel Serapio, our Director of the Institute for International Business and Cyber at CU Denver. Manuel?
Yes, Karen, thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Manuel Serapio, and I serve as Faculty Director of the Institute for International Business and Center for International Business Education and Research. Long name, title, and we commonly refer to it as IIB Cyber. So on behalf of the IIB Cyber and the Office of the Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, Academic and Student Affairs, Provost Nakuma, I would like to welcome everyone to this lecture. We started the International Executive Roundtable over 30 years ago, and the idea was to invite subject matter experts in international business, international studies, and related fields to address a contemporary topic of interest to students, faculty, and business practitioners, those who are very passionate about international business. Let me also acknowledge our supporters for this lecture. We have the Gibson Fund that has sponsored and supported this lecture, among others. Mr. Greg Gibson, who unfortunately could not join us this afternoon. Also want to recognize Karen and Kayla and Connor and the team at the Institute for International Business for putting this lecture together. Susan, I would like to add my personal welcome to you. Looking forward to your talk. Karen, turn it over to you. Thank you very much for putting this together.
Thank you, Manuel. So before I introduce our speaker today, I just want to note that throughout the lecture, please put any questions in the chat box and we'll take them during the lecture. And then there will also be time for a Q&A at the end where you can unmute and talk as you'd like. So today I'm very excited to introduce you all to Susan Pfuetze, who has been involved in global trade and logistics for 20 years. The last 11 of which have been at Otter Products, which you may all know more commonly as Otter Box. At Otter, she manages the movement of product around the world, including the import and export into various countries, such as the US, Canada, and the EU. She also manages the freight forwarders and transportation of Otter shipments. Along with all of that, she also oversees the compliance and security programs at OtterBox. So Susan, thank you for joining us. We can't wait to hear all that you have to say, and take it away.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the great introduction, and thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to be on this and talk to you a little bit about OtterBox and just some of the major changes that we've seen come about in supply chains in the last 3 or 4 years, in large part, which were brought about by COVID, but other forces as well. Let me just quickly tell you a little bit about OtterBox if you're not familiar with it. We make primarily what we're best known for and what we make the most of is protective cases and screen protectors for handheld devices. So for example, when there's a launch of a new iPhone or a new Samsung or any sort of a tablet, that's a really busy time for us getting up and running and getting our manufacturers making product. Our supply chain and our situation is a little bit unique. Previous to Otter, I worked at Payless, so I came from the fashion industry. Well, affordable fashion, I guess you'd call Payless. But I thought our time to market and our speed of manufacturing had to be really quick because we had to meet certain promotions and things would go out of style quickly. But I didn't realize that that was nothing compared to the way OtterBox has to have its products hit the market. We don't know very far in advance what the new devices are going to look like. So we have to get our molding tools up and running and tested, and all the product manufactured and on our customers' pegs in their retail stores a couple of weeks before new devices ever launch, because that's when a big part of their sales are. So our time to market is incredibly fast. And as a result of that, we source very heavily from trusted partners who we know can keep up with that pace. And then it's frustrating sometimes being a partner of ours and a manufacturer of ours, because then we'll have these lulls where we don't need them to make nearly as much as during these peaks. So we have these peaks and these ebbs and flows of our business. And so along the way, we've developed some very trusted partners, but it definitely requires a unique relationship for them to be okay with having 100% manufacturing capacity, and then have that dip down to a much lower level. But a little bit about OtterBox. We'll be celebrating our 25th anniversary this spring. OtterBox started in the garage of our founders and still our owners, Kurt and Nancy Richardson. Kurt is an entrepreneur that just has great ideas and loves to introduce them to various markets. And he's had a lot of good ideas over the course of his career. But one of his best ideas was what later came to be known as OtterBox. And so in addition to making cell phones cases, he started off just making what was called a dry box, and it was just a box that was intended to keep things dry for hunters and boaters and campers. If you had like matches and film and cameras, anything that needed to stay dry, you could put in these boxes. And that was kind of his first big product that he made out of his garage when he first started the company 25 years ago. Along the way, as production picked up, he started manufacturing things overseas in China and started selling things in various countries. Now OtterBox has close to 1,000 employees worldwide. Our headquarters is here in Fort Collins, but we also have entities in Hong Kong, Cork, Ireland, and then we have warehouses through various parts of the world. So a lot of change over the last 25 years. We make a lot of different products now, but that was kind of where we got our beginning. So today I'm going to talk a bit about, it's a little bit different than I had originally told Karen. I'll stick to that topic, but one of the big things I wanted to talk about was just the forced change for OtterBox and probably many companies in the recent couple of years, and how our supply chain works and where we source our product. And part of that's a result of COVID, and part of it's about a result of other things happening in geopolitics today. So. And as Karen mentioned, anytime you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat, and I can answer the questions as we go along. What I'm going to talk about today is just some of the challenges that we have seen in our supply chain over the last few years that has forced us to change. I'm going to talk a little bit about inertia. And for those of you who haven't had physics for a long time and forgot what inertia is, I will explain what that is, because it's something that heavily drives our business, other businesses, and maybe in our personal lives as well. Some of the changes that we've made in the recent years, and just what the next 5 years is going to bring for Otter, if we can predict that. I anticipate there will be even more changes that we'll see coming forward. As I mentioned, COVID did bring about a lot of changes for a lot of companies in the United States that sourced product from anywhere in the world, globally. Obviously, COVID brought about a lot of changes in many areas, but supply chain is one of those things that you maybe didn't hear much about before COVID. And then as all the companies faced the challenges, it really showed kind of the way the American companies have their supply chain set up showed sort of a weakness or a weak link that we all had in our supply chains. Our heavy dependence on China, for us, particularly at OtterBox, but many other companies as well. And that was really, that really created a huge challenge for us in COVID. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the various challenges that we faced over the last few years and what changes this has brought about for us, and actually some really positive changes that in the end are definitely for the best of the company and for the health of the company. So when I mention inertia, and I'll talk about that a little bit, for those of you that don't remember what that means, is a company or a person has the tendency to continue on the same path unless something forces them to change that path. So here at Otter and many other companies as well, we're continuing on the same path of our dependency on sourcing out of China. China is a very easy country to source out of. Very easy to they understand our business model very well. They understand our needs very well. They bend over backwards to meet our needs. The companies in China have been instrumental in allowing the United States and other Western countries to import relatively inexpensive product into our country. They have built up a huge mechanism that is very well developed for Western countries and companies to be able to source from there. The infrastructure is very solid with roads and the highway network and the industries that are there for manufacturing. Pretty much any industry that you would need is set up in China. They've made it very easy to get product from one location to the port. A lot of their companies and manufacturers have built up right around the ports to create that ease. And so you can order something from a company in China to manufacture, and if you're going by air, have it here within just a couple of weeks from the time you ordered it. So it's truly been an amazing mechanism that they've built up, and many of us became extremely dependent on China because of that ease. And moving out of China, as many of us have tried to do over the last 20 years, has been very challenging because it's so easy to do business with China and so difficult to do business in a number of other places. But when COVID came along, we began to realize that all of those benefits that we had from China were challenged. It was much harder to get out of China, and it brought about a lot of changes. But there were other things that were changing leading up to that time, which also forced us to look at new trading partners. And one of those very first things that we started facing a challenge with, and this was prior to COVID, this started back in about 2018, is what are called Section 301 duties. Around that time, and this was during the Trump presidency, we were having some issues, the United States, with China in various areas, including, as you probably know, China is a member of the World Trade Organization, so we can freely trade with China just like we can with any country that's a member of the WTO. But they weren't following some of the practices that countries that are part of the World Trade Organization are expected to follow in terms of human rights, openness to trade, and various other things where they were going against that. So another area where we were seeing issues was violation of intellectual property being stolen from various US companies, and just as a result of that, also a threat to national security. So some industries were targeted as a result of that, and the reaction to some of those issues was to increase the duties on those specific products from China. Section 301 duties evolved, without getting into too much detail on this particular piece, evolved into a very different area after that. They didn't just revolve around areas that were a threat to national security, but rather, practically any product had Section 301 duties applied, including our product, which is just plastic. So our product, wouldn't be deemed as a threat to national security, nor does it have too much intellectual property that would at all threaten the country in that area at all. But Otter, like most importers, saw an increase of our duties. For us specifically, for our particular product, our duties went up by about 150%. So we were at a duty rate for most of our product that was 5.3%. And then that went up to, for a little while, to 20.3%, and then went back down to 12.8%, but still a huge increase. When you add that up over a full year, it's, you know, millions and millions of dollars increase that you're paying more. So that was when we first started seeing a challenge for us, for our company, in getting product from China. So that was, of course, well before COVID. About a year and a half before COVID, we started to realize that we may need to start sourcing our product from places outside of China, because we didn't anticipate the conflicts that we were seeing with China and the US-China relationship improving anytime soon. Those duties have been in place, and Congress decided to keep them with the new administration. The Biden administration decided not to change that structure of duty rates. And so those duties have been in place for, I guess, about 4.5 years now. They've found that they have not been successful in getting China to change some of its policies that the US was opposed to, but I think they have found that it has been effective in getting companies, US companies, to move out of China for manufacturing to other locations, because those duties are much higher than we would pay from other countries. So for example, if we manufacture that identical product in Vietnam, the duty rate would be 5.3% instead of 12.8%, which reflects a several $1 million annually savings if we don't manufacture in China. Another thing that, and this was largely as a result of COVID, and many companies saw this increase as a result of COVID, were freight rates. So for Otter Box, we did, in pre-COVID in 2020-ish, 2019-ish, we did about 85 to 90% of our volume air freight from China. So that can get very expensive, but it fit our model. As I mentioned at the beginning, our time to market is so fast, we don't have much of an option but to air freight everything in from China to get it onto our customers' shelves before the new devices launch. So we depended very much on China. We depended very much on air freighting everything here. As we saw COVID come about and things start to close down in China, of course, one of the things that also was greatly impacted was travel back and forth between Hong Kong and the United States. Our product primarily flew on passenger planes in what's called the belly cargo space. So as the passenger planes, there's multiple flights every day from different parts of the United States back and forth between here and Hong Kong, and provided ample space for our product and many other companies' product in that belly space of those passenger air freight airlines. As we saw those come to a complete halt in 2020, so no more air travel, that really forced things to change in the freight market. They converted a lot of those passenger planes to cargo planes. And for Otter, and this is a good thing in the end, it forced us to turn some of our freight into ocean shipping. Good for two reasons. One, because it's much cheaper, and two, obviously much more sustainable and much better for the environment, which I'll get into that in a little bit. So we saw our air freight rates in the 2021 timeframe go up to 3 times what we were paying in 2019, early 2020. So we saw our duty rates go up 2.5 times. We saw our freight rates go up 3 to 4 times. And so, even if you have a fairly healthy margin of your revenue to your costs, even those types of increases can eat in pretty heavily to your margins. So our margins took, and at many companies, margins took a big hit on those two hugely increased costs. So sourcing from China was a challenge for those 2 reasons. Now, it was difficult to get our product here. It was difficult to pay the duties on it because those were very expensive. But Otter continued to source our product from China pretty much predominantly in the 2020 time period. As we saw that things weren't going to improve a whole lot, especially with COVID continuing, much longer than many of us anticipated, we decided to break this inertia. So this dependency that we'd had on China, this dependency that we'd had on using air freight, we knew that there needed to be a different solution. So we started exploring new countries. We'd been manufacturing in Mexico for a very long time, since before I ever started working at Otterbox about 11 years ago. We'd been sourcing from Mexico, but we hadn't been very dependent on them because Mexico doesn't have quite the ability to meet our needs as our Chinese partners did. So we'd had sourcing problems with our suppliers, with our partners in Mexico, that we weren't able to resolve very well. But as we faced these challenges with China, we turned much more towards our Mexican partners and depended much more on them. And that helped in 2 or 3 ways. It helped us in our freight rates because obviously it's much cheaper to ship things to truck things from Mexico up to the US rather than air freight. It helped in duties enormously because our product is NAFTA or USMCA eligible, meaning it's, instead of being the 12.8% from China, it's 0% when it comes from Mexico. So huge savings from getting product from Mexico. The other thing it helped in was just the ease of the transportation of something being trucked in a 2 or 3 day trucking trip, as opposed to the different legs that it has to take when it comes from China. So while our Chinese manufacturers are very quick at making things, we're able to save that time using our Mexican partners just because the transit is much shorter. So sourcing from China became more and more of a challenge, but it's also a dependency that we had become very accustomed to. One of the biggest challenges for, you might hear in the news a lot, the government might have plans and they might share their initiatives of more US manufacturing and say that we need to buy America and make things more in the United States, which is a great concept and a great idea. And I'm sure we would all love to do that. But what's really challenging is for our industry in particular, but many other companies as well, is those industries simply don't exist in the United States. There is for us, ours is the molded plastic industry, and there is no industry like that here in the US. So if we were to start manufacturing our product here, we would have to go train and find manufacturers that could learn how to make our product. We have made a few items here in the US, and the way we found an opportunity is to go into the Detroit area, former car manufacturing facilities that maybe made part of the plastic components like dashboards or something for cars. And since that Detroit area has declined so much in US auto manufacturing, there's been some open space, and we've been able to train them in how to use our molds and manufacture here in the US. And that's been a win, but it's not necessarily something that we can sustain, just given our model, as I mentioned, our time to market needing to be such a short window. It's easy to get that time to market from China with the industry already well established there. Here in the United States, it's definitely very expensive to try to get that same level of service. Obviously, our wages are much higher than they are in China. Our working conditions and requirements are much different here in the United States. So getting that same type of product that we got from China is a much bigger challenge here in the US. So we've looked towards other places outside of China, the US being one, but it is a big challenge because those industries just honestly do not exist in other countries outside of China. China's built up the plastic molding industry better than any other country out there. What has helped us immensely is companies larger than us moving out of China to new countries. For example, Apple primarily manufactured most of its product in China up until a few years ago, and their movement out of China to different countries helps Otterbox and many other companies as well, because they have the resources to build up the infrastructure of those countries, the ports, the roads, everything needed. They have the resources to build those industries where they didn't previously exist. And Otterbox, being a relatively small company, we don't have the resources to develop an entire industry in another country, nor the resources to develop the roadway system and the ports and all of that in another country. But if a company bigger than ours goes in, and there's many others doing it as well, and builds that infrastructure, then we definitely benefit from that. So as these larger companies went into new locations such as Vietnam and Indonesia, we were able to follow a year or so later because those roads were in place. We started shipping out of Vietnam a couple of years ago. And a lot of our new product that we make out of Vietnam is what we call our power products. So those are like battery packs and wireless chargers, things like that. We started manufacturing those in Vietnam. And when we first started doing it, the transit time would be about 3 weeks. And this was even air. And that's because they only had one flight from Vietnam to where we were going in the United States every other day. And then a lot of times it was filled with other companies. In that time, in the couple of years that we've been in Vietnam, they have probably tripled, if not quadrupled, the number of flights coming out of Vietnam. The roadway system has improved immensely over the last few years, and Vietnam has reached a level. They after the Section 301 duties, they saw a huge influx of business into their country, just overwhelming. They couldn't manage that amount of business as companies were leaving China and coming into Vietnam. So it was very difficult to find a manufacturer. But now that things have steadied and they've opened new facilities, it's much smoother there now. At one point, we were trying to get our product out of Vietnam, and we were getting air freight quotes, and it was going to be our manufacturers that we were using were near Hanoi, so we needed them to fly out of Hanoi. And one of our freight providers had a flight out of Ho Chi Minh. And I thought, well, Vietnam's not a very big country. Maybe we can truck it up to Ho Chi Minh and fly it out of Ho Chi Minh, since there's capacity out of Ho Chi Minh and not out of Hanoi. So I thought, I'll just look at a map, and it turns out they were just, a little over 100 miles apart. So I thought, well, great, that's no big deal. There's capacity out of Ho Chi Minh. We'll fly it out of there. And then I pressed into Google Maps to see about the transit time, and it looked like it. And when you plug it into Google Maps, it was going to take about a full day drive from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh. And I thought, what? It's only about 100 miles, or a little over 100 miles. We're not going to be able to add an extra day onto our transit time, or it might even been more than a day. And then I realized when I asked our freight provider about this, it said, yeah, well, the road between Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh is very busy and not very well built. So it really does take 14 hours to drive that distance. So it just gives you an idea of, as I mentioned, China has built itself up to be so ideal for American companies to source out of, because their infrastructure is so modern, and they make it so easy to get your product to the port. And Vietnam just has not had this opportunity to build up their infrastructure in the same way. So it really is a very different supply chain challenge when you start going into other countries such as Vietnam or Indonesia to source your products, not only because they don't have the same number of flights, the same advanced level of ports as China has, but they also just don't have the ability to ship from there as readily as China did. So that was another big challenge that we faced over the last couple of years, is our dependency on China, almost like an addiction to sourcing out of China, and having to change all those things was very challenging. And we've come to trust our partners so much that finding a new partner was very, very difficult. But what was the most beneficial to us is our Chinese partners foreign direct investing in these other countries. So we would work with our same China partners, but they would open up manufacturing sites in a country outside of China so that we could take advantage of the lower duties out of that area. For example, one of our partners in China opened up a couple of facilities in Vietnam. So that helped us save on the duties, because then our product was manufactured in Vietnam as well. Of course, it didn't meet the US's concern towards China and threat to national security, because these are still Chinese companies ultimately that we're buying from. They're just setting up their manufacturing sites in different countries. So it unfortunately didn't address that need, but it did help us in having a trusted partner just in a different country. So Section 301 duties and the conflict with China, COVID, the freight rates, our trusted partners in China, and having to find new countries to source out of, new partners. The last thing I was going to talk about, and the final challenge, is even well before COVID, I think in about 2018, China started an initiative called the China 2025 initiative. And basically what this was a 5 to 10 year plan to develop more advanced industries in China. As I mentioned, Otterbox and many companies have depended on China for their low cost labor, and our product is very labor intensive. So it makes it much cheaper to get it out of China than other places, because it's relatively labor intensive, and the labor that is required to make our product is it's fairly low tech. So it was fairly inexpensive to source out of China. China's initiative wanted to develop the economy and move more towards high cost labor and more high tech labor. So they have identified 10 industries, including mostly technology in industries, that they're planning on developing in China, or have been developing in China. And they have the state, the government has poured a tremendous amount of financing into developing these industries. They've also made policies for foreign direct investment that have made it much easier to make those more high-tech product in China than low-tech product like ours. They've made a lot of policies to sort of disincentivize low-tech labor. Wage rates have gone up considerably in China over the last few years. And so where we used to see China as an advantage in terms of lower cost product, it's no longer lower cost on a product like ours, because labor rates have gone up so much in the last few years as they continue to move towards this China 2025 initiative. They've put a number of other policies in place that have made it more difficult for a product like ours to be manufactured in China. In addition to those labor rates going up, they've made it difficult for us to manufacture a product there without providing certain intellectual property information to our vendors. And all of this is in an effort to promote these industries there. And so if it's not falling into the promotion of one of those industries, they've definitely disincentivized Western companies from trying to manufacture product there. I'm not sure if that's advertent or not, but it has made the manufacturing of product for our product in China much more difficult. Another thing that we're currently seeing right now is a much heavier monitoring of sourcing from companies where there's a violation of human rights in China. And again, this goes against what is human rights that are, as they're written in the World Trade Organization, World Customs Organization. So companies need to go pretty far down their supply chain beyond just their what we would call tier 1 vendors, beyond just who they're directly sourcing from, to make sure that the sourcing of those sources, and then 3 tiers down, are not in an area that is using slave labor or violating human rights, child labor, anything like that. So it takes quite a bit of investigation to make sure that you're being compliant and that your products that you're importing from China are compliant. So definitely the right thing to do, but has created an extra level of challenge in getting product out of China that we didn't have before. So these are the challenges that we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years. A lot of them brought on by COVID. I think we would see these challenges anyway. I think COVID just highlighted them sooner than they otherwise would have been highlighted. And I think it forced companies like Otter out of China more quickly than it might have otherwise. For us at Otterbox, it might have otherwise taken us 10 to 15 years to start moving our manufacturing out of China without COVID. COVID pushed us much more aggressively to get out of China sooner than we had before.
Susan, we actually have a couple questions in the chat that I think relate to some of your challenges, although now I see your next slide that
Oh, no, I can.
You might already address them anyway, but you've already answered a couple of them actually, but the others are around, have you seen challenges on the political side with China and Russia or Hong Kong? Will that create a new challenge for Otter?
Yes, yeah, I think, I just read a update this morning about, actually, no, I take that back. That was specifically with Taiwan, but it was similar with Hong Kong about a year ago. It has created a challenge for us. Part of it was due to COVID. For the COVID regulations that China had up until about 2 months ago, for our products, most product for companies that manufacture product in China and that air freight their product, they'll manufacture likely in the Shenzhen area. That's a big manufacturing area. And then they'll have it trucked across the border to Hong Kong, and then the product will fly out of Hong Kong to various airports in the United States. Ours specifically is LAX. When COVID came about, Hong Kong and China each had separate COVID policies that frequently conflicted and also created some challenges because of that conflict. And obviously these regulations were put in place to protect the people of China and the people of Hong Kong, but it made it very difficult and expensive to get product out of there. One was, it used to be that the truck would come from Shenzhen and cross the border into Hong Kong, and that whole transit took maybe 2 hours. With the COVID requirements, they had to switch trucks and switch drivers at the border because they wouldn't allow people to cross those borders. So the reloading of a new truck, the finding, so the freight forwarder would have to find twice as many trucks and twice as many drivers, because instead of taking one truck and one driver like it used to, it now took 2 trucks and 2 drivers. They also saw a big decline in the people that wanted to work along the border. So there were fewer resources to use for that border crossing. So all of those things made what used to take 2 hours then take about 2 days to get across for that final border crossing. China had some extremely rigorous requirements where they would not let the driver of the truck exit the vehicle during the time that they were waiting in line. They actually went so far as to tape their door shut so they couldn't get out, because they didn't want that person coming in contact with anybody from another country because of the COVID requirements that they had. So that created a huge challenge and additional costs as well. And we saw our rates for freight on the origin side go up 5 times as much because of these new policies that each of those countries had put in place as a result of COVID. That kind of indirectly answers the first part of the question about the relationship between Hong Kong and China. Now that they have both relaxed those requirements a little bit, we see a little less of that. I wouldn't call it a conflict between China and Hong Kong. It's probably more of aggressions towards Hong Kong, I should say. We've seen that impact our company a little bit less. However, if the United States is to make policies that would not enable us to use that transit anymore, that would certainly impact us a lot. If it had to come directly out of China, that would force a lot of changes. With respect to the conflict in Russia, yes, that event has had a lot of impact on any company, just because since Russia was, I think, I don't remember the exact number, the 3rd or the 4th largest oil producer in the world, and that changing the oil supply by quite a bit, fuel surcharges for freight went up considerably, about 3 times what they were before that conflict happened. It also cut down on a number of the flights used to fly over Russia, or a number of the planes were sourced out of Russia. So those types of things where we don't source out of Russia anymore, or we don't we as a globe, as the whole world, don't have access to the same amount of oil that we used to, changes things for everybody. It doesn't have a direct impact on Otterbox in the sense that we didn't source anything from Russia or from Hong Kong, but the kind of reverberating effects that those global geopolitical conflicts have on other countries and other companies has an indirect impact on Otter. It's just less fuel for everybody, higher costs for everybody, less planes for everybody. So we continue to watch all of those things closely. And along with that, China's more recent aggression in Taiwan and US changing kind of policy towards Taiwan will have an impact on us. We manufacture some of our product in Taiwan, and if Taiwan is no longer recognized as a sovereign nation, that could certainly have an impact on us. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. Well, do you foresee there being a challenge if China increases their relationship with Russia? As far as whether you stay in China?
That's an excellent question. Yes, because I would expect that if China were to aid Russia in the war against the Ukraine in any way, that the United States will probably enact some regulations and some restricted party rules that would probably heavily impact us. Right now, as I mentioned, China being a member of the World Trade Organization, without the Section 301 duties, regardless of what they do, we have the same duties coming from China as we did before. But I would expect if the US were to put in some reactionary policies in place as a result of that, that would certainly impact Otter for sure. Fortunately, we're beginning to move out of China, but that's not to say that it's complete. That'll take years to complete. We still source about 70% of our product in China, down from about 90%. So we've come a long way. But yeah, if we couldn't source out of China anymore, that would have a very big impact on our company. But certainly that would be the right thing to do, is to find a new location to source our product. So we're headed in the right direction.
Yep. And so as you are finding new sourcing partners, which you might come to, so if you are going to answer this during this next slide, please feel free to just tell me. But have you engaged the commercial services from the local U.S. Embassy to help vet or identify potential suppliers? And did you find that helpful if you did? And have you looked into any other Southeast Asian countries like Thailand or Malaysia?
Those are great questions, and I wasn't going to answer that otherwise, so I'll answer that now. We did not use that, but that is a very good suggestion. What we have done so far in finding new sourcing partners in each of the new countries that we've moved to is use one of two sources. One, either the Chinese company itself investing in a different country and building up manufacturing in that country. So for example, some of our Chinese partners have built up manufacturing in Malaysia, in Vietnam, and even in Mexico. And so we have been using that same partner in the sense that it's the same company that we're buying from, but they've set up manufacturing sites in a different location. The reason that works really well for Otterbox is because, as I mentioned, we've developed this relationship with these partners over the last 15 or 20 years. They're some of the few vendors that can meet our very rigorous requirements on time to market that we have, that are just unique than probably most of their customers. So we don't want to get rid of that relationship. It's very desirable for us to be able to continue using that same partner and then just move to another country of origin. So that's the main method that we've used to find, I guess, new partners in new countries, is to use the same partners as they develop that industry in another country. The other reason this works really well for us is because they're very experienced in that industry. As I mentioned, China is extremely experienced in our particular need, which is plastics molding and manufacturing. And then in the power product we make, the battery packs and that area, they're very experienced in making those things. So if they are investing in setting up new manufacturing sites, we can sort of transfer that know-how to that country without us having to do it ourselves. It's our previously existing relationship and partnership with a provider that we already know, that we know can meet our needs. Setting up the facility there. So that's the way it's worked for us so far, and we haven't had to use any outside resources. The other avenue that we've used is if a company is bigger than ours and has, as I mentioned before, I gave Apple as an example, if they've started to manufacture something similar in another country, we have awareness of that and can use, since it's kind of a non-competing industry, something that makes something that's similar to ours but not competing with ours. If they've already built up the manufacturing in that country at that company, then we can utilize that as well, since we're not making a competing product, but that factory will have that know-how and that knowledge to know how to make product for them, so that they will know how to make it for us as well. So those are the two ways that we've found new partners, but that is a good suggestion and we can certainly look into that. Any other questions on that part so far?
That's it for right now.
Okay. The next part is that I'm going to talk about is just the adaptations that we've made, the changes that we've made to kind of break this inertia, as I've called it, and just to meet the new challenges. COVID brought about a lot of changes in everything, every aspect of human life, obviously. Everybody started to work from home for a long time period. Of course, schools were closed, students learned from home. People started buying their groceries just to be delivered. They bought meal kits to be delivered. So much of the way we did things and do things changed a lot because of COVID in a very short amount of time. Companies reacted to that. And so for OtterBox, this brought about a lot of change too. We changed a lot of the product we made. So to stay on top of all of this, and find new avenues for buying our product, so whereas you might otherwise go into a Best Buy or a Verizon to buy our product, people weren't going into stores anymore. So one of the adaptations, one of the things that we changed as a result of COVID is, and many companies saw this, was a lot more e-commerce. Our e-commerce sales went more than doubled. Those have declined a little bit since stores opened back up again, but I don't anticipate they'll ever go back to the levels they were pre-COVID. I think the ease of buying stuff online now changed a lot with COVID, and so we see a lot more e-commerce sales than we used to. Another area that we have adapted to is just different product. In the bottom left of this slide, you can see a product called Livery. One of the products that we started to develop pre-COVID but really took off during COVID was our temperature controlled delivery containers. So if any of you have ever ordered groceries from the store to have delivered, or meal kits to have delivered, likely it's come in some sort of carrier where, to keep the items cold, it maybe was corrugated cardboard and dry ice. OtterBox developed a product that was not only sustainable, because you can reuse these hundreds of times, but also just a cheaper, in the end, a cheaper way to deliver things. So these are temperature controlled delivery containers that our main customers are like Kroger's, so like the grocery store industry. They'll use these for people who order their groceries online and have them delivered, because they can have multiple temperature controls inside the carrying container. So you can have some items remain frozen on one side of a divider, other items remain refrigerated on the other side of the divider, and these come with ice packs. And then the consumer, after they have their groceries delivered, leaves them outside on their front porch, and then the grocery company has these collected afterwards. So this is one of the products that we started to develop before COVID, but really took off during COVID with both the meal kit and the grocery delivery. Another area where we saw a lot more sales than we used to were, we used to sell maybe 5 or 10% of our sales were cases for electronic tablets like iPads. As more students started doing school from home, as more people started working from home, there was an increase in iPad and tablet sales, and as a result, a huge increase in our volume of making tablet cases, both for kids and for adults. We saw a new line, we introduced a new line a couple of years ago, our OtterBox Kids line. So since much more children these days have tablets, both as a result of school and various reasons, we have a new line that is just specifically for kids. So another way that we've adapted to the challenges from COVID and other challenges is just changing our product, changing the way we ship things, changing our avenue for sales from being primarily in the stores to a lot more e-commerce. Another adaptation that I mentioned, I talked about our new sourcing partners. We found new partners to source with. A lot of that has been the same partners in new locations. The most recent one we have is one of our Chinese manufacturers setting up a manufacturing site in Mexico. And this, as I mentioned a little bit before, this meets a lot of our needs because it's a manufacturer that we've had a relationship with for over 20 years. They understand our time to market needs. They understand how fast we need things to go. They understand our quality requirements. So to be able to work with them and not have to pay the freight and the duties from China anymore because they'll be manufacturing their product in Mexico has been a big win for us. So that's a new adaptation that we've made that's been very beneficial. Another practice that we've changed, and this is definitely for the betterment of the environment, is we started shipping a lot more from Mexico. So trucking product is much lower carbon footprint than air freighting product. And B, we've done a lot more ocean shipping than we have in previous years. And ocean shipping is even more of I think the carbon footprint of an ocean shipment is about 1/100th of an air shipment. When you look at the weight. So one of the positive side effects that these changes have brought about is just a more sustainable supply chain model where we're getting more product from closer locations now. Just looking at the next few years of where OtterBox is headed, I doubt that freight rates will ever go back to what they were pre-COVID. We've seen a return to close to pre-COVID. So as I mentioned, at their peak, which was early last year, they were 3 times what we were paying pre-COVID, 3 to 4 times. Ocean rates were actually about 6 or 7 times, and still cheaper, obviously, than air, but just went up a huge amount. Freight rates, I don't think will ever go back to pre-COVID times for 2 reasons. One, as we mentioned, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has greatly reduced the oil supply in the world. So fuel prices will not go back, jet fuel prices, but all fuel prices will not go back to what we saw pre-COVID, I don't think ever, or potentially for a long time. The second reason I don't think they'll ever go back is as I mentioned, in China, labor rates have gone up a lot. And so the transit of our product from the factory to the Hong Kong airport is about 3 times what it used to cost. And because of that China 2025 initiative that I mentioned, where labor rates are going up and the higher level of difficulty crossing between the China and Hong Kong border, that will never probably go back to what it was pre-COVID either. So while rates might go down a lot, I don't anticipate they will ever completely disappear. So as I mentioned, COVID brought about a lot of changes for Otter in terms of our supply chain, but these were changes that were going to come about anyway. I think COVID just accelerated it. There are a number of reasons that it makes sense to lessen our dependency on China manufacturing One of them is COVID, but the other that is probably not going away anytime soon, perhaps ever, and that's the U.S.-China relationship, which has deteriorated a lot in the last few years. I don't anticipate that will go back in the near future. U.S. companies are being incentivized to source closer to home. There's a couple of concepts that you might have heard of that OtterBox is also practicing. One is called nearshoring. You've probably heard of that one. So nearshoring being manufacturing our product closer to home. So whether in the United States, that might not be an option for many manufacturers, including OtterBox, but nearshoring can also be manufacturing in our hemisphere. So manufacturing much more in Mexico. We've increased our production in Mexico 2 or 3 times what it was about 3 years ago. We're also looking into manufacturing in Latin America, bringing it closer to home. We'll cut down on the transit time, we'll cut down on the duties, and we'll cut down on the risks of sourcing out of China. So that's one thing that we are definitely practicing. There's another term that's come up recently called friendshoring, and I think it might have been Janet Yellen that coined that term. And friendshoring meaning providing U.S. companies incentives to manufacture and source product with countries that are friendly towards the United States. So we don't any longer consider China as one of those countries. And so there will be, I would imagine, increasing number of policies made in the US to discourage sourcing from China and sourcing more from countries that are friendly to the United States. So that might include other Southeast Asia countries that we mentioned before, Taiwan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. It might include countries like India, any countries from the European Union. Of course, that can be a little bit more expensive. Any country with whom the US is friendly, there will be incentives for manufacturing in those countries and pulling manufacturing out of China. Catherine Tai, who's the US Trade Representative, gave a talk recently about US approach to sourcing and to global trade. And for the last many decades, maybe within all of our lifetimes, the thought of sourcing for US companies has been to do what's the most efficient, what's the cheapest, which country makes that product the best. And we've always looked at manufacturing as where is it cheapest to make that product? And she suggests that there needs to be a different way to look at that now. So don't look at what is the most efficient, but what makes your supply chain the most resilient? Because there could be another global pandemic. There will inevitably be more geopolitical conflicts. The more diversification that we have in our supply chain will help us be prepared for anything that comes that we can either anticipate or not anticipate, some natural disaster. If we put all our eggs in one basket, all of our resources in one place, do all of our manufacturing in China, then we won't be prepared for all of those things as they might come. So she says the focus for companies and global trade now should be more one of resilience. She likened it to getting an insurance policy. So you pay however many hundreds of dollars into your insurance policy, say health insurance, and you're healthy, so you're pouring all this money in. But when a disaster or tragedy hits, you have that insurance policy to cover you. So you're more resilient towards whatever might come your way, even if it may have cost you more in the long run to do that. It helps you avoid that risk. And the same thing for global supply chains. The more we diversify them, the more resilient we are. Rather than just looking at what's the cheapest and the most efficient, we should be looking at what will make us the most resilient. So looking at our supply chain like an insurance policy. Yes, it costs OtterBox a lot more to manufacture our product in Mexico and the United States and Vietnam than it costs us to manufacture our product in China. That expense is actually diminishing. The difference between those places is being reduced, but even though it costs more, it is still a more a less risky way to look at one's supply chain. So OtterBox is definitely headed in that direction. It takes companies a long time to move their sourcing out of China. We've grown very dependent on it, but just kind of changing the entire mindset and the whole kind of world order paradigm that we've always had exist before, and just looking at it at a very different way will be how OtterBox and I'm sure many other companies will do it in the future. The other advantage that has for us is it's just, and one of OtterBox's major initiatives in the coming years is sustainability. So as we source things from the United States or from Mexico, that's a lot more sustainable than sourcing things from China coming air freight. A lot more sustainable to source them from the United States with more sustainable solutions and materials with less transit, not using air freight is the direction that we're headed in the coming years. So we'll look towards suppliers that are closer to home, not necessarily in the same country. So we'll still see a lot of international trade. We'll continue to look for new products that meet people's needs, such as chargers and products made out of sustainable sources. Currently, OtterBox has a line of cases that are made out of recycled cell phone cases. So we take our old cell phone cases, we have them ground up, and we make new ones out of them. So that's been a big project of ours. And so as we look forward, we will continue to look towards sustainability, to look towards what we call friendshoring, and to look towards more resilience in our supply chain, because just being efficient is not going to be enough anymore for any importer.
On the topic of, oh, great. On the topic of new products, when a new iPhone or Android, I'll throw Android in there for my sake because I'm still an Android. When a new phone releases, what's your timeline to produce and release new cases?
That's a great question. So our customers, our biggest customers are places like Best Buy or Costco or Walmart or Verizon, T-Mobile. Those are our big customers. They like to have our product on the shelf to sell 2 or 3 weeks before the new device ever launches. The reason is because when people buy a device, a new iPhone, they spent however much money, $1,000, $2,000 on that new device. As soon as their new device comes in the mail, they want to have their OtterBox case and their screen protector already there and be able to put it on. Or when they go to the Verizon, they pre-order their phone, they want to have the cases there already. So we have to have our product there a couple of weeks before the new devices ever launch, which means from the time that we might get some idea of what these new devices are going to look like, our cases, have to be molded to the fraction of a millimeter to hit all of the different ports exactly right. So we have to have some information ahead of time. We have to build the tools, run the tools, do the quality control, and manufacture the product and ship it to the United States. That's why we can't use ocean shipping a lot except for replenishment. And that timeline is about 2 months from start to finish. So very tight window.
Yeah, well, that's you get the product there before it's even needed.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, and that's what our customers require. Just so they found that they can have the most sales if it's there before the device is ever launched. And
yeah. So another question is, can you explain what types of businesses Otter owns and operates in foreign countries, if any? And for those businesses that you own and operate, can you explain generally how you staff locally to be able to manage compliance with foreign and US laws regarding labor, taxes?
Mm-hmm. We have entities in Hong Kong and in Ireland, and those entities are just offices. where we do primarily sales and some logistics and things like that. Then in terms of manufacturing, we do what's called contract manufacturing. So in other words, we don't own the manufacturing site. We partner with a manufacturer that has plastic molding. What we own is the tools or the molds. That's our intellectual property. And so they load these molds into their tooling manufacture, into their tooling production to mold our cases. So to make sure that we're compliant with those countries' regulations, we depend on the partner in that country to be compliant. We do audits. Otter's a member of CTPAT, so we do two kinds of audits. One, well, we do more than two kinds of audits, but specifically related to that, we do two kinds. We do one that's a social responsibility audit to make sure that the manufacturer is not employing any child labor or any prison labor, any type of labor like that. And so we have that type of audit. We also have a type of audit for security reasons to make sure that everything they're doing is secure and compliant with US law. A lot of our customers have extremely stringent requirements in who they source from, such as Costco, Walmart, Apple. So anybody that sells product to them, anytime you walk into a Walmart or a Costco or an Apple store, the products that are in there that are made by other companies, there's a very rigid set of requirements those companies have to follow, and that's in terms of social responsibility, environment, and security. And so to even source and sell to those customers, you have to meet US requirements on all of those areas. Does that answer the full question? There were multiple parts to the question. I'm not sure if I hit all the points.
Yeah, yep, I think you did. And on that, kind of on the same stream there, for your offices in Hong Kong and Ireland, do you hire mainly locally then, or expats?
Oh yeah, all local. Yes, everybody that works in those offices is all. Oh, and I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, we also have an office in Shenzhen, China. So the office in Shenzhen is all China nationals, all in China, and in Hong Kong, all Hong Kong nationals. And then in Cork is, I'm sure there's been some immigration from other countries in the EU into Cork. I think some of the people that live there are originally from other countries, but live in that country now and are all local. Yeah.
Yeah. So in your manufacturing plants, can you speak to your programs and practices for protecting your IP, both legally and operationally?
Mm-hmm. We have, so as I mentioned, we own our own tools. And so the tools themselves are what are our IP, because those molds reveal a lot of information about not just about OtterBox and what we're making, but also about the device. And so the Apple device or the Samsung device or whomever might be making that. So by owning those tools, that helps us control them a lot. One of the things that we do to control our IP, there's a number of things we do. One of the things that we do is we have a tool counter that counts how much product we produce on that tool, and that has to match how much we bought from that tool. So it would be obvious if one of our molders were on the side manufacturing, thousands of more cases and selling them under a different name, for example, because it wouldn't match with what we've ordered off of that tool. And so that's one way we protect it. When we no longer make those cases, the tool is destroyed. And to oversee that destruction, we have quality engineers at each location. So we have quality engineers in Shenzhen to oversee our Asia operations, and quality engineers in Mexico to oversee those operations. So they have a number of roles, one of which is making sure the tools are destroyed when they're end of life. Another way we protect our IP is we work with US Customs on sort of the description of our imports. And so US Customs plays a very big role in this for our company and many companies. You send them sort of a guidebook. And so if anything goes outside of those that guidebook that importers send, if anything is a red flag, then they're able to identify it and track it down. So for example, in ours, we're the only ones that are allowed to import our brand into the United States. So if they see our brand coming in under some other importer, then it raises a red flag. And so Customs does a very good job of identifying that type of product. If it comes into a port that we haven't identified that our product should be coming through or going to an address or a location that's not on our list of approved locations, and they're able to identify it that way too. So that partnership with Customs has really helped us find a lot of counterfeit product coming into the United States.
Have you had some IP issues, and what did you do about that?
Yes, we have a whole department that manages our brand and IP issues, and so we've sort of developed that as different issues have come about. Molded plastic is a fairly low barrier of entry. You know, it's not super technological. It's not very complex to enter in. It's quite easy to counterfeit our product in terms of you know, just plastic molding and putting the name on it. So we've sort of developed all of these different things that I just mentioned as a result of having issues with those in the past. And at the very beginning, I mentioned our partnership with our vendors. One reason that we don't want to harm that partnership or get rid of those partners is because it takes a long time to develop trust between an importer and a contract manufacturer. They have to prove themselves. They have to be able to meet our needs. We have to know that they won't ever be manufacturing our product that's not intended for us and be counterfeiting our product. So once we've established those relationships, we don't want to, it takes a long time to build a new relationship. We don't want to get rid of them. So another way that we help manage that IP is just having very trusted partners, of which we have. So a lot of our molders we have had for over 20 years. And we don't want to do anything to threaten that relationship just because they're a very trusted partner, and it's hard to find good partners. So that also helps us control our IP. And if they were ever to do anything that would jeopardize that relationship, then they wouldn't be our partner anymore, of course. So that would be a big loss for Otter. So that's another way we control our IP, is just having very trusted partners, and that relationship takes a while to develop.
Have you been, during your tenure with Otter, have you been in on some of those relationship building moments with new partners? And if so, how do you go about building those really strong relationships?
Yeah, I have had the opportunity to develop those. And one thing that's really important that suffered during COVID is kind of face-to-face time with your partners, meeting with them in person and recognizing. So going to China and meeting with your manufacturers there and understanding, you know, that relationship and being able to meet face-to-face has been really integral. And then when we had COVID, it sort of took a big step back because we didn't get that chance to meet face-to-face anymore. So that's one way to develop it, I think, is just being on site, being able to meet with them, seeing what they're doing, seeing their manufacturing facility, and knowing them in person goes a long way. We also do various types of audits, as I mentioned, and those audits kind of help build the relationship too, because the manufacturer invests quite a bit of resources into passing that audit, whether it's for security or labor or whatever they're investing in to pass the audit. That strengthens the relationship because it shows that they're willing to invest in our company to make sure that they pass the audit. And that's another key to developing the relationship is their commitment to investing into our product.
Great. So another question here is, which countries in Latin America might be suitable to outsource your products from, harnessing the closeness and lower freight rates within the same continent? So
that's a great question. Mexico, of course, is the main one and the only one we've used at this point. For a couple of reasons. One, the proximity, obviously, since they're a neighbor of ours and very close, and everything could be trucked since we're connected, so nothing needs to be air freighted. In fact, believe it or not, it's generally even faster to truck something from Guadalajara to Colorado than it is to fly it, just because the flying, it has to get to the airport, it has to be picked up from the airport. So in the end, the trucking is faster. So Mexico being the most obvious one because of the proximity and because of our free trade agreement with Mexico makes it even cheaper. And because Mexico has a plastic molding industry already very well established. Other countries we've looked into, but they don't have that industry. They're farther away. We don't have a free trade agreement with them necessarily, or a finally established free trade agreement with them. We've looked into Central America. They don't have a solid plastics manufacturing industry there. We've looked at a couple of countries in South America, including Colombia. Same type of thing where they don't have as much of that type of industry that already exists there. What OtterBox kind of needs is for some other company to go there first, a bigger one, as I mentioned, and develop that industry, and then we can kind of piggyback off of that. For us to set it up on our own is definitely more of a challenge. But the main nearshoring country that we use right now, of course, is Mexico. And within Mexico, we source everything from Mexico. So our packaging for our Mexican product, for the product that's molded in Mexico, also comes from Mexico. Everybody that works at the location there is also from Mexico, including our engineers that are at that location that are OtterBox employees.
What are some of the new technologies that you've deployed in enhancing your design, manufacturing, logistics, sales, company in general?
Trying to think of which technologies that have already launched that I can speak to, and be careful not to list the ones that haven't launched yet. But well, one of the new technologies that borrowed from our already pre-existing expertise was what I had showed before, the livery brand product, which is our temperature controlled delivery containers. So it was new technology in the sense that it is very lightweight insulated boxes. So where we had to develop new technology was you can buy a cooler that'll control the temperature and keep ice frozen for 6 days, but it's extremely heavy. And if you're shipping something, you don't want it to be heavy. So one of the technologies we developed was making insulation that was extremely light so that these boxes are very light. Also understanding what would impact the ability for our customers to use these. And so our first round of making these livery boxes, we didn't make them so that they would nest in each other when they were empty. So when they were being returned, the return logistics piece of it, obviously if you can nest things in each other, if they're empty, you can ship 10 times as many in the same amount of footprint or space that you take up. But before they nested, it would take a full truckload to ship, 100 of these, for example. Whereas now that they nest and we've kind of changed the design a little bit, we can now ship quite a few more. So that's another technological advancement that we've realized in the last couple of years. Some of our technological advancements, we partner with other companies that have that technology and created like a co-branded product. And one of those is a partnership we had with Corning, the glass manufacturer. You might know Corning through things like your casserole dishes and stuff that you might have in your kitchen, but Corning is a glass manufacturer of all different levels. They make windows for the space shuttle. They also happen to make the glass, it's called Gorilla Glass, that's on the front of an iPhone or a Samsung. So we partnered with them and used their glass technology to make glass screen protectors. So our glass screen protectors that are like the more top of the line ones is a partnership with Corning using their advanced glass technology that they have. And then the last example that I can think of off the top of my head that's both cheaper and environmentally friendly is a new tool design that we have with much lighter weight tools that can be reused. Previously, when product launched, we'd have to mold brand new tools for every single product. And these are this tweak of this design allows us to not have to mold a brand new one every time a new device comes out, but rather kind of reuse the existing steel and the existing tool. That's more sustainable for a couple of reasons. One, they're a lot lighter to ship, so less carbon footprint. Two, we have to ship them less frequently because we can modify the existing tool. And three, we can use the same steel, so we don't need to get a new steel run going each time. So those are the latest technologies that come to the top of my mind that we've used.
As far as product, how much product do you produce daily and or monthly or on some sort of time?
That is a great question.
Or on a daily basis, how much product of yours is floating around or flying through the air? Do you know?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, a year, millions of units, but it's very cyclical. So if we're talking about August, the month of August, a few million units will be coming in the month of August. If we're talking about February, it'll be about 20% of that. Because as I mentioned, our big peak times are when new devices launch. That's when people are buying cases. So there's big device launches for Samsung, for example, in the January timeframe, and for Apple in the September timeframe. So we see really big peaks, excuse me, in like December, January, and August, September, and then it'll be much lower. But we have about 7 main manufacturers, main ones in the world, and they're it varies a lot, but when they're at full peak capacity, they're outputting, each one is outputting maybe 100,000 units a day, but it's very cyclical.
What country is your largest buyer beyond the US? I'm assuming the US is probably number one, but
Yep, US is number one by a lot. I would say that's a tricky one because, like, as I mentioned, we have 2 other entities. We have one in Cork, Ireland, so that it would be for all of our EMEA customers. So everybody in the EU and the Middle East and Africa. We do not have very many customers in Africa, so that's very low volume. And then we have an APAC entity in Hong Kong, and their biggest customers are in Australia and Japan, probably. But I would say, even despite all that, I'd say probably for North America, Canada is definitely our biggest country to export to. And for APAC, Australia represents about 80% of their sales. A lot of that has to do with just in the United States, you know, we're very practical. If we spend $1,000 or $2,000 on a device, we don't care as much if we show off that device. We want it protected. We don't want it to break. We don't want to have to buy a new one. So Americans are very pro things like cell phone case protectors, because we definitely want to protect that. And we don't care as much about showing the world that we have a Samsung or an iPhone as making sure it doesn't get broken. In other countries, they prefer to kind of show off, and it's more of a status symbol to have an iPhone or a Samsung or that sort of thing. They don't want it covered up by a heavy case, so they're not as inclined to buy a cell phone case. So our sales for sure are biggest in the United States. And since Australians are maybe in that way somewhat similar to Americans, that's why APAC's biggest customer, the country that's most likely to buy a cell phone case, is Australia. China, obviously has a huge population, but it's harder to sell into China. So we have smaller volume going there. Japan is probably our second biggest for that area. And then for EMEA, their biggest, I'm sure, is one of the countries within the EU, probably Germany. Outside of the EU is probably the UK, and then maybe Saudi Arabia is up there as well.
Wow, very interesting. Interesting allotment. Well, I think we have time for one more. Well, there's one right there. Well, they're coming in hot here. Okay, so you mentioned having offices and partners in significantly different time zones to the US. How do you manage information flow and operational activities? Assuming you have online meetings, how do you organize those given the time differences?
That's a great question. There's one time that works for all three entities to be able to meet, and it's only desirable for EMEA because they're in the middle, and it's a terrible time for everybody else. And that's like at 7 in the morning our time, because then it's like 9 at night for Hong Kong, and it's the afternoon. So it's either early for us or really late for the others. If all three of us don't have to meet, and it's just like us in Hong Kong, for example, which is pretty frequent, then we usually meet in the evenings, like around 7 o'clock, because that would be like 9 or 10 a.m. for them. That doesn't work for EMEA, so that we can only do that if EMEA is not on the call, because that's the middle of the night for them. So it is hard to manage, and there really is just one time of day that works for all three of us if all three of us need to meet. But definitely, with the way things are now, being so modern, like we can, people don't need to be in the office for meetings anymore. So you can dial in from your computer, even if it's a challenging time from home. Also, meetings can be recorded so people can hear them the next day. So we use that a lot. In terms of data and information, we store it in different types of software where that can be shared with the people it needs to be shared with. So our vendor can go in and pick up a piece of information from a particular source that we use called Agile, and they can have the engineering drawings and the information they need and access to just those. It's a very controllable environment where you can just provide access to certain things to certain groups. So we utilize that type of software a lot. But yeah, it can be a challenge. I'm sure it's no different than lots of companies face, having probably being global. And then the other thing is you just have to be used to sometimes having meetings and emails in the middle of the night, things be urgent in the middle of the night. But
it happens, definitely. And I think this is going to be our last question. How does current US inflation and signals of an economic recession affect number of shipments coming in and OtterBox's inventory management?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think anybody is immune to that. Inventory management has always been a challenge for us because our sales are dependent on the sales of the device. So the more that people buy iPhones, the more of our product that sells. If people decide that they don't want a new iPhone, whether it's because it's not that much different than the previous year, or whether it's because it's a recession and it's something that's a luxury item that they can forego, so their sales impact our sales. So inventory management is very challenging because we have to be able to predict how the devices are going to sell to know how much of our product that we send in. We also have a very liberal policy with our customers in terms of return rights, so that we have a very great relationship with our customers. We allow them very liberal return rights if they aren't able to sell their product as a result of those devices not selling as well. But yeah, inventory management is always a huge challenge, even without a recession. With a recession, it probably makes it even more challenging, because whatever we anticipated as being sold is probably going to be less of that. And then with respect to the recession, certainly people probably have a tendency to not run out and buy a brand new cell phone necessarily, with job losses and things like that. So we, just like everybody else, can anticipate our sales going down in the coming year over what they were before. At the same time, what it also could mean is that because people are keeping their devices for longer, they might need a new cell phone case because maybe their old one broke. So it's hard to know exactly how that'll impact us, but we can anticipate that it'll impact us just like it does for any retailer.
It's an excellent point about, do you then start reproducing some of your older cases because people are keeping their phones longer, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we see an upsurge in our sales of when a new iPhone, for example, launches. For example, this past year, the iPhone 14 launched. They usually have a sale on the previous year's model. So usually you can get an iPhone 13, for example, for much cheaper. So we always have an upsurge in needing of the cases for iPhone 13s around that same time that a new device launches, because people buy the year-old device for cheaper.
Very interesting. Well, I think that's it. We're very close to, well, we're out of time. So I want to thank you, Susan. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a very interesting discussion, and I hope everybody else enjoyed it just as much as I did, which I'm sure you did based on all of the amount of questions that have come in. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and we will have more International Executive Roundtable series soon, so keep an eye on your email. We will send an invite. But thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
It's excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.